about the men in the bunker.
We can say that the recent sightings are in no way connected with any secret development by any agency of the United States.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
What are you reporting?
With someone or something crawling around out here.
But what I'm here to tell you is that everything we have been told is a lie. All part of cosmic unconsciousness.
They got away with killing Kennedy, they got away with the UFO war hoax, they emboldened them to do this, and they got away with that. And until these criminals are caught and exposed, they're going to keep using our money to lie to us and to kill people who try to cover it up. That's my rant. Back to you, Michael.
Listen, without the bunker, where are you gonna go? Tell the truth. To find the truth. To find it here, in the bunker.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the bunker. I want to thank all my fans for sticking with me through this long hiatus. Coming to you from the new studio at the new location. I have stated multiple times to friends and acquaintances that the studio is complete. It's complete. We're ready to start recording, and then something else happens. So, essentially, we are in a state of flux still at this point. But I'm here to tell you that with the new intro, with the new year 2025 coming around, we are going to be delivering some pretty awesome episodes coming up, and this one is no different. This episode, I'm going to focus on an individual book that was part of my journey into being red-pilled. You know, for those of you that don't know, this is a reference to the movie The Matrix, where Neo is sort of given the choice in the beginning of the series, excuse me, to either take a blue pill or a red pill. And he eats the red pill, and he will be taken down the quote-unquote rabbit hole, and he's going to be shown all the secrets, right? If he takes the blue pill, he's just going to wake up just like normal. He's going to go back to sleep, quote-unquote, and live life just like everyone else, and just not know that anything else nefarious is going on behind the scenes. I no longer have that luxury of taking the blue pill, and it's a big reason why there have not been more bunker episodes, to be completely honest with you. I've looked into several different historical events, just in general, some current, some historical, And it is become abundantly obvious that everything we have been told is a lie, just like it says in our intro. And so this episode is going to be a sort of an introduction into that sort of theme. This is going to be an ongoing theme for this season of The Bunker. I'm not sure how many episodes this is going to encompass, but we're jumping into it here, and we're gonna stick with it for as long as it takes. So again, I appreciate everyone who has stayed with me and who has, endured not only the episodes I've put out, but also the episodes I've not put out. So in this episode, we're going to be jumping into a topic that, I can say that this was the beginning of my red pill journey. And that was the book that is entitled Lies My Teacher Told Me, published in 1995, written by James Loewen. And what I'm going to be focusing on is something that, is a holiday that just recently passed, and that is Halloween. I'm sorry, not Halloween. What am I talking about? It is, of course, Thanksgiving. And not only just Thanksgiving, but the stories and the mythology that we have been told as gospel about Thanksgiving that is not true. Now, to just a little bit on the author. So James Loewen was born February 6, 1942 in Decatur, Illinois. He died August 19th, 2021 in Bethesda, Maryland. He received a PhD in sociology from Harvard in 1970. Began teaching classes in sociology, but over the years, he began his teaching career in an all-black college. I'm pretty sure a majority black college in the South, Mississippi, perhaps. I'm blanking on the exact location, but either way, I was a majority a colored student body, and he began to notice certain things in his own classes. He became aware of the inaccuracies in high school textbooks. And not only the inaccuracies about just the basic stories that are in our history textbooks that are shared by many, many different iterations and different publishers of history textbooks in the United States, at least up to the point where this book is being published in 1995, which covers, to be honest, the time I spent in high school, because I graduated in 1990. So some of these things that he's talking about, some of these inaccuracies in history textbooks, applies directly to me, because I'm sure that I've read some of these stories and believe some of these stories up until reading his book. So he began to notice these, not only the inaccuracies in the books, but also their effects on the students. So, like I said, in 1995, he writes Lies My Teacher Told Me, which, was the first step in the direction towards my awakening towards the truth, which is that everything we have been told is a lie. And what James did with this book is, to me, is valuable beyond measure. He basically, what he did is he looked at a list of popular history books that were used in high schools in the United States, and then he spent years running down all the stories that were outlined in those books, and found all of the information in those books that were incorrect, that these publishers got wrong. And he spent years in, for example, the Library of Congress. You may hear my chair creaking because, like I have said before, I'm sitting on an antique, inside of an antique. And so this book, to me, was like such a major step for me towards awakening to the truth that what the stories that we're told about our history are not correct. Many of you may be saying, oh yeah, of course, I know, I've been on this boat for a while, welcome aboard. I've been on this boat for a while. I haven't podcasted about it because The Bunker is, it is my second journey into podcasting. The first being Paranormal Brew, which is strictly paranormal issues, which is still ongoing by our friend Taryn. Shout out to Taryn. But the bunker was an expansion of that. And so I expanded my definition of paranormal and wanted to, and honestly, I wanted to start over from scratch to see what I could do from the ground up without any outside sort of influence, right? And so I expanded the definition a little bit. What I have done during this sort of hiatus of the bunker is I've made the decision to go back into many of the things that I have questioned for years and expand the scope of the bunker once again to incorporate, not only the paranormal issues and psychic phenomena and, synchronicities and all those interesting things we love to talk about, but also include stories that we were told that are just not true. And so when I thought about doing this portion, this kind of topic for the bunker, my first thought went to lies my teacher told me. This was my first explosion to my mind, the first sort of bomb that went off in my paradigm that sort of allowed my mind to expand and just start questioning things. That sort of always felt off. So like I said, he looked at this list of history books and that were used in high schools, spent years running down all the stories and proving how they're not true. And he, in my opinion, very convincingly shows us that these inaccuracies were done. They were done on purpose, and fill the role of what we would call propaganda. And in his intro to the book, James tells us like an important fact that we all sort of know about history classes, and most people have listening to this have experienced this, and that is that most history classes are painfully boring. And more than that, they leave out a lot of details that many people would agree reflect poorly on the quote-unquote character of the nation. Things that were done by our government, by citizens in the name of government, people that were, that may work in media, whoever that may be, just a common citizen in a certain situation made a choice that was terrible or did something that was terrible. And our history books sort of leave these things out conveniently because a major sort of theme of history textbooks, at least up until the publication of this book in 1995, I'm sure it's still the same, was to leave the reader of these books under the impression that historical figures are always shown in a positive light, and leaving out all the terrible things that were done either in the name of government, by the government, by a politician, by just a random citizen, etc. And because all of the bad decisions are left out, what you're left with is this boring story with no nuance. There's no struggle. There's no suspense. There's no, oh my God, I wish that hadn't happened, or, oh, this individual was, faced with unbelievable circumstances and they made the wrong choice, but ultimately it led to this. There's no nuance to it. And it doesn't ring true. And I think that's why most kids in school find their history books and their history classes more broadly just boring, because there's no realism to it, because all of the real stuff is taken out. Yeah, and so like history is dominated, as compared to other classes in high school, for example. History is taught basically straight from the textbook. And the lessons that were taught by the teachers rarely stray very far from the textbook, which is not true of a lot of other subjects. The textbook's there to give structure, to give a starting point perhaps, or to give, a place to begin inquiry, right? And then you through creativity, you take that lesson from there and you move forward. You know, a lot of, and there, you know, there are some history teachers that do just that. They take the textbook, that's where the lesson begins, and they go from there. And they use their creativity to force students into those situations to think about, hey, in this situation, what would you have done, right? But those are few and far between, and honestly, not because of any sort of, not a knock against the teachers, but it's the framework within which they're operating. They're not allowed to stray from the textbook. When it comes to history, they're told, you follow this text, you stay within these goalposts, and you teach this. You know, and you can maneuver around a little bit in between these goalposts, but you're not going to stray too far from the lessons in this book, right? And one of the things that James points out in his introduction is that textbooks never tie the present to the past or the past to the present. That's because all these negative things that are also part of our history are just removed. And so there's all these missing pieces in the chain, right? And so, you know, events in the past, which obviously have impact where we are today, because, you know, time and history happen chronologically, and obviously things that happen in the past lead to what's going on in the future, right? And so the result is that historical events are looked at, as James states, in a vacuum, he says. And so what I'm going to do is actually read from his intro, starting on page 3. Okay, so here James says, textbooks seldom use the past to illuminate the present. They portray the past as a simple-minded morality play. Quote, be a good citizen, unquote, is the message that textbooks extract from the past. You have a proud heritage. Be all that you can be. After all, look at what the United States has accomplished. While there is nothing wrong with optimism, it can become something of a burden for students of color, children of working class parents, girls who notice the death of female historical figures, or members of any group that has not achieved socioeconomic success. The optimistic approach prevents any understanding of failure other than blaming the victim. No wonder children of color are alienated. Even for male children from affluent white families, bland optimism gets pretty boring after 800 pages, which is the average amount of pages in a your average history textbook. You're looking at 4 to 5 pounds in about 800 pages. Loads of information, loads of battles and dates, and but not a whole lot of real substance, right? James goes on to say, why are history books so bad compared to most textbooks in a high school setting? And he says that nationalism is one of the culprits, and textbooks are often muddled by the conflicting desires to promote inquiry and to indoctrinate blind patriotism. And there I think is the rub, because if you see, and I think clearly there's an agenda here behind the individuals that are making these textbooks and deciding what's in them and more importantly what's not in them. And when you have this dichotomy, this struggle between just giving the students what historically took place accurately, and this desire to promote this blind patriotism, this ethnocentrism, this just under any circumstances you have to defend what was done, and you have to under any circumstances you need to make sure that you come away with from a history class feeling like, oh, well, those people did the best they could. They didn't make any bad decisions. Because the agenda behind the textbooks and the reason that this has been, the publication of textbooks has been done the way it's been done is because history isn't about just teaching what historically took place. It's not. It's about also doing that, but at the same time, the primary agenda behind history, social studies, if you want to call it that, if that's how it was called in your school, it was to leave the student with a positive feeling about the founders, the founding of the country, what had to take place for the country to form, and and so forth. So that's why you can tell there's a clear agenda here, and it begins with the book covers and the titles. The covers are plastered with images of American flags and bald eagles, like a Statue of Liberty, red, white, and blue everywhere. And the titles give it away as well. I mean, some of the books that he looked at, for example, to write this book were The Great Republic, The American Way, Land of Promise, Rise of the American Nation. This is like these very mythological themes, right? He's not reaching here when he suggests that, blind patriotism is one of the goals of quote unquote social studies or history class, right? And when you look at the covers of the book and the titles of the books, it supports his theory. And you're looking at, like I said, 4 to 5 pounds of book, per history book, about 800 pages. And as of the printing of this book in 1995, and I have no reason to believe it's any different now, the history profession, there's no league of history professors, or what's the word I'm looking for? There's no union of history professors that gets together and looks over history books to point out inaccuracies. Because the point of this episode is not to come down on history professors or history teachers. It's not, because like I said, they're sort of painted into a corner to have to teach only within these goalposts, that may move, I'm sure, over time, depending on current, events and so forth. So my goal isn't to crap on history teachers, but it is to just simply show that the framework within which history teachers are framed is not to just teach historically accurate events, and also not to have students think about the deeper issues or the implications that come along with the things that were done in our history, because they're many, right? And so, because there's no group of history teachers reviewing the books and pointing out, hey, this isn't correct, and getting those things fixed, the errors are just allowed in those books to just endure, generation after generation. And there's no correction that takes place, right? And so, where does that leave us? That leaves us, my primary focus on this episode is the story of Thanksgiving, right? Now, there are many historians that speculate that if the epidemics brought to the New World by Europeans, which happened, there's loads of historical evidence that this took place. If those diseases were not brought here by the Europeans, which utterly, completely ravaged the native population, if those things had never happened, then the colonization of America wouldn't have been possible. I mean, there most likely would still be a list of colonies, who knows how many, right? This is just speculation, and they say that much of the West would still be native to this day because of the number of native people that died just from the diseases that were brought to the New World, and came as much a surprise to the native population as to the pilgrims and the Europeans that came. It was as big a surprise to all of them. And, the end result is that the vast majority of native people died from disease that never even saw European settlers. I mean, that's pretty shocking. Henry Dobbins actually lists the diseases that ravaged the natives from the years, approximately 1520 to 1918, and he has outlined a shocking list of, because it isn't just one. I mean, I think the people that have heard of smallpox ravaging the Native Americans, I mean, that's a story that is more popular and more accepted now today than it's ever been. But that's just one pandemic. That's just one pandemic that ravaged these poor people. And Henry Dobbins actually lists these. And there were 41 different outbreaks of smallpox. 41. There were 4 outbreaks of the bubonic plague, the Black Plague. 17 pandemics of measles. 10 outbreaks of influenza. There were 25 outbreaks of tuberculosis, diphtheria, typhus, cholera, etc. That's not the whole list. 25 breakouts of each of those. And that's probably not all of them. That's just the major ones. One thing I can say is that Europeans were some dirty ass diseased people, for one thing. Oh my God. But these outbreaks occurred when Europeans made contact, and I don't laugh to make light of this. This is awful. This is a wiping out of an entire continent of individuals, the vast majority of them anyway. So this is when I laugh talking about this stuff, it's because it's shocking and it's disturbing, and it's the kind of thing that if you sat and thought about enough would make you sick and bring you to tears. And this is the reason why our accurate historical history is so important. Because I'm sure I'll state this again, without accurate historical accounts of what took place in a country's history, it is impossible for that country to have an actual, accurate, stable, and healthy, and cohesive national identity. It's impossible. But many of these outbreaks that took place, they took place the instant in the 1500s when, in 1600s when Europeans landed on the East Coast. And some of these outbreaks, started ripping through the local tribes up and down the eastern seaboard and began spreading west. And when villages were ravaged by disease, the survivors who were still carrying the disease would escape and go west and go to other tribes to look for solace and for safety. And in so doing, they would spread it. There was also lots of evidence that the Europeans, not so much the religious pilgrims and Quakers and so forth, but soldiers, Indian hunters, just mercenaries, individuals that were just here to make money, which is a vast majority of the people that came here, by the way, understood the disease and understood the pandemics and actually used it to help spread smallpox, to wipe out the people so they could take their land. This is a documented fact. And many of these outbreaks that started on the East Coast, they just continued moving west, and they didn't stop until they hit the Pacific Ocean. And this caused not only millions of deaths from the diseases themselves, but for those that survived, think about their worldview completely crashing down around them, causing them to doubt the faith in their gods, their medicine men and women. And this led to many of the individuals that survived, that were lucky enough to survive the pandemics, ended up turning to alcohol, despair, suicide. So much suffering it can't even be grasped by the mind. It's beyond it's beyond awful, to the point where if you can picture this and you can rationalize what this is like I would question your sanity, because it's insane beyond. I mean, it is estimated that 98% of the native population died as a result of just the diseases and the depression and conflict that resulted from these diseases, just wiping out villages, wiping out so many villages that there weren't even anyone left to bury the dead. And so entire villages were just left to just rot on the ground, because there was no one left to do the burial rites, to give the dead the respect that they would give as per their, personal, their tribal ritual, right? And so, I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people died. They were just left to rot, where there were, Europeans would loot the bodies. They would loot graves. I mean, it was bad. It was really bad. And to go back to the issue of the textbooks, like what is history textbooks treatment of the plagues brought by the Europeans? And James, he actually states on page 77 that with the treatment of the plagues in high school history textbooks, it is not surprising that 1 out of 100 of his college students knew anything about the plagues. 99 out of 100 of his students did not know that there were plagues that took place in North America, were brought here by the Europeans. 99 out of 100. So I will now read an excerpt from his book, pages 77 to 78. James begins, "Unless they have read Life and Liberty, students could scarcely come away from these books thinking of Indians as people who made an impact on North America, who lived here in considerable numbers, who settled, in short, and were then killed by disease or arms." So then he goes on to say, the textbooks mistreat the Indians, they mistreat the Pilgrims, that there's almost no information in here that is historically accurate. And that's unfortunate, because without, like I said, I'll probably repeat myself again and again on this episode, without an accurate portrayal of what actual historical events took place and what Americans, quote unquote, or the government, or whatever, what natives or the Pilgrims, whatever group you want to talk about, if you don't give an accurate description of what happened and what they did in those circumstances, then it makes it impossible to have a sense of cultural identity in your country. It's impossible. Because if everything that you're basing your definition of the United States is based on a lie, then you're mistaken. Then you're mistaken. And that's unfortunate, because students in high school aren't asking to be lied to. They're just showing up to class. They're showing up, and they're getting their books. They're putting their book covers on. In my day was from paper bag book covers, and they're showing up for the class, and they're just being fed unbelievable inaccuracies, and it's being sold to them as truth. And it's unfortunate. And so here, like James says on that page, he said, these textbooks mistreat the natives and they mistreat the Pilgrims. So how is that? How does he go on to explain that? Well, the major story is one of the ones that probably most people have heard in their history classrooms, and that is the story of Plymouth Rock. And Plymouth Rock is used as a vehicle of American exceptionalism, because that's not the only place that Europeans landed on the New World, and some of the other stories are not good. Not good. The story of what actually took place in 1492, for example, not good. That was a mass land grab and gold grab, and many, many thousands of people died horrible deaths as a result of individuals coming to the New World in pursuit of riches, not in pursuit of what we're told they were in pursuit of, and that was religious freedom and et cetera, right? I mean, some of those people, I'm sure, also had religious freedom in mind when escaping Europe. And let's not totally shit on the Pilgrims or the Europeans who took a huge chance leaving Europe in the fall, getting on a ship and sailing across an ocean that was, maybe their destination was known, maybe it was in question, who knows, but just picked up and packed up everything they owned and jumped on a ship to sail across a dangerous ocean to go to a new world, in search of whatever. Plug it in, whatever they were in search of. That's still a brave thing. So I'm not going to just sit here and crap on the Pilgrims nonstop. But as we'll get into later, you'll see that, these history textbooks are not kind to the Pilgrims either, because they are also not portrayed accurately. And I just mentioned the story of Plymouth Rock, so I'm going to go back to the book, and actually I'm going to read James's words from pages 80 to 81 about the Pilgrims. Okay, here he says, in their pious treatment of the Pilgrims, history textbooks introduce the archetype of American exceptionalism. According to the American Pageant, quote, this rare opportunity for a great social and political experiment may never come again, end quote, the American Way declares. The American people have created a unique nation. How is America exceptional? Surely we're exceptionally good, as Woodrow Wilson put it. America is the only idealistic nation in the world, and the goodness started at Plymouth Rock, according to our textbooks, which view the Pilgrims as Christian, sober, democratic, generous to the Indians, God-thanking. Such a happy portrait can be painted only by omitting the facts about the plague, the possible hijacking, and the Indian relations. So, leaving out all the actual details, this sounds pretty good, right? So he goes on. For that matter, our culture and our textbooks underplay or omit Jamestown and the 16th century Spanish settlements in favor of Plymouth Rock as the archetypal birthplace of the United States. Virginia, according to T.H. Breen, quote, ill-served later historians in search of the mythic origins of American culture, end quote. Historians could hardly tout Virginia as moral in intent. In the words of the first history of Virginia written by a Virginian, quote, the chief design of all parties concerned was to fetch away the treasure from thence, aiming more at sudden gain than to form any regular colony, unquote. The Virginians' relations with the Indians were particularly unsavory. In contrast to Squanto, a volunteer, the British in Virginia took Indian prisoners and forced them to teach colonists how to farm. In 1623, the British indulged in the first use of chemical warfare in the colonies when negotiating a treaty with tribes near the Potomac River, headed by, let me get this name correct, Chiskiak. The British offered a toast, quote, symbolizing eternal friendship, unquote, whereupon the chief, his family, advisors, and 200 followers dropped dead of poison. Besides, the early Virginians engaged in bickering, sloth, even cannibalism. They spent their early days digging random holes in the ground, haplessly looking for gold instead of planting crops. Soon they were starving and digging up putrid Indian corpses to eat or renting themselves out to Indian families as servants. Hardly the heroic founders that a great nation requires. So there you go, people. So not only do history textbooks selectively edit actual accurate historical information, but what they do is they selectively edit and leave out certain stories that don't follow the narrative. And what is that narrative? The narrative is American exceptionalism. You were to walk away from high school history feeling like the United States is the best thing that has ever happened since the wheel. And if you question it, you're insane. And if you read historical textbooks, up until the publication of this book in 1995, if you read history textbooks that I read in high school, you might come away feeling that way. But that's not the truth. And so this popular theme of like the rugged European pilgrim forging through the wild wilderness to establish settlements was literally never true. The village of Plymouth, Massachusetts, was selected to settle due to the fields of corn already planted, a nearby harbor, and a brook of fresh water. Corn planted by natives that had all died from plague. All this area where they had settled was no longer occupied because they were all dead. So not only directly did some of the natives actually help Europeans and reach a hand out to them and help them to thrive and survive in the New World, but also just circumstantially. Once you move into a place, you make contact with a group of people there. They show you that, we grow corn and this, and these are the crops that grow here, and these are the ones that don't. Here's where you grow, here's where you don't, here's where you fish, right? Once you get all those things out of the way, and then all of a sudden they're all dead. So now, I can't really blame someone who was looking for a place to survive. Suddenly there's all this room. You didn't bring the disease consciously with you. It came with you, and it killed all these people around you that were not equipped to fight off all these diseases that had long ago in Europe been overcome, right? Because Europeans are dirty fucks. But the point is, circumstances really favored the settlers, not only through direct help from the natives, but after the natives all died off, now you have a sort of a rudimentary working understanding of how to survive here, and now all of a sudden they're all dead, and then you have all this room to spread out, to build a house, to do whatever, right? So the story of this rugged European pilgrim, like I'm sure there are cases where that is actually accurate, but on the whole, that's not true. And speaking of this settlement in Massachusetts, before the plague, this was Squanto's village of Patuxet. This was a settlement that just a few years prior to this was home to over 2,000 native people. And I bring up Squanto because he's a more popular image or individual on the native side that's brought up in a lot of these textbooks. And what is told in these textbooks is Squanto is this native individual that made peace with the Pilgrims, and he spoke English and he translated for them, and he helped them to survive and find how to where to go to find pelts, where to plant, where to like all of the things, right? Not only how to survive, but how to thrive and how to make a profit for these early settlers. And I keyed upon Squanto on purpose because he is someone that, like I said, shows up in these history textbooks. But has anyone ever asked, how exactly did Squanto learn English? How was he able to ingratiate himself and just like settle in with the Pilgrims, knowing English and can help them translate and help them to farm and all the stuff like that? Yes, he was a native individual of this area, and so he knew how to survive and farm and hunt and what time to do this and what time to do that, correct, right? But how did he learn English? Well, this is something, again, vacant in most textbooks, but the way that Squanto learned English was that he was kidnapped by an English captain along with 4 other Penobscot Indians in around 1605. They took him back to England to be sold into slavery. Squanto himself and the other four were spread out, from different, quote unquote owners, right? He ended up in Malaga, Spain. He escaped his captors in Spain. He fled back to England, where he convinced an individual named Thomas Dermer to allow him to accompany him on his next trip back to Cape Cod so that he could return to his village. He returned to Patuxet, and he found all the members of his tribe were there when he left. By the time he returned, after just a few years in England and in Spain, he returns to Patuxet, and he finds all the members of his tribe are dead from the plagues. And this is why he took up with the Pilgrims, because he could speak English. All his family and friends were dead. Everyone he knew was dead. But he could communicate with these newcomers who were religious for the most part, and so he took up with them because he knew that an individual by himself in the wilderness in those days just doesn't survive, right? And what an incredibly tragic story. It's enough to break your heart. And if this were a Hollywood movie, you could easily picture yourself watching this film, watching him come back to his village. There's music playing in the background, a bunch of minor keys, this orchestral, depressing music playing in the background. You could picture yourself, you could picture audiences filled with tears watching this, because it's horrible, right? But think about how compelling of a story would that to tell in a history class. How many deeply impactful questions or assignments could you attach to a story like that to give to your students? Go home and think about this. Think about this if this were you. Think about if you left your village of, in my case right now, Mount Holly, Trenton, New Jersey, whatever town you're from, Connecticut, New York, California, whatever country, Spain, England, India. Just imagine being taken from your village, your town, all the people you knew, all the people that you were related to, all the people you had fun with. You're taking against your will across the ocean. Must have been terrifying, just in and of itself, right? And through bravery and through your wit and through your mastery of this new language, English, you're able to escape these individuals in Spain, escape back to England, find an individual that would trust you and that would allow you to, work on his boat, to allow you passage back across the ocean. You come all the way back across the Atlantic Ocean. Must be terrifying. Going through storms. And you get back and your village is gone. It's gone. Everyone in your village is dead. All your family's dead. All your friends dead. Everyone you've ever known dead. What do you do at that point? These are the questions that could be asked in a history class. These are the things that could, they might give kids nightmares. But good. Because if the things that were done in our history would give nightmares to kids learning about it, let them have nightmares. Let them have the nightmares. Because it might take those nightmares to wake up the next generation. It might take those nightmares to wake up that next generation and prevent that genocide, like the genocide happening right now, as I speak. To prevent that from happening next time, right? Maybe that's why it's cut out. And, let's not forget, most settlers coming to the New World, they made the journey because they were looking for economic advancement. They were looking at, they were hearing these tales of these endless miles and miles of natural resources no longer available in Europe. And there were some individuals that were looking for religious freedom, but that was a small minority. Most individuals on the ships coming to the New World were looking for economic advancement. And if it weren't for people like Squanto, people like Habermas, individuals that, after losing everything, threw in their cards with the Europeans, with the settlers, with the Pilgrims. If not for those individuals, those settlers would not have survived. Not only would not have survived, they wouldn't have thrived. They wouldn't have been able to help them turn a profit, which in turn brought the next shipload of Europeans, and then repeat that over and over and over again, right? If Pilgrims and settlers came here and did not thrive and make profits, some of them crazy amounts of profits, if that didn't happen, those other ships of people would not have come. And that would have changed the entire landscape of North America. And what do I mean by that? Well, for example, King James, many other early pilgrim religious leaders gave thanks in those days to the plagues. Gave thanks to the plagues and gave thanks that it spared them because it showed that God was on their side. The story of Thanksgiving is one of the foundational myths that give us this feeling of entitlement. It gives us like this ethnocentric outlook. Thanksgiving is a ritual, says James. And he cites Mircea Eliade, who says that our Thanksgiving story hits 5 ritual observances of origin myths. Origin myths are very important because they give this cohesive sort of thread that holds citizens together that may be from different backgrounds. It gives them like a cohesive story to become connected with, and that allows them to become connected to others that may be from different backgrounds. And so I've studied some Joseph Campbell both in college and just on myself independently, and so when I hear the mention of myth, my ears perk up. And why is that? Because myths are powerful stories. They are stories that collectively we all accept as true, or if not historically true, we all collectively accept their value. And just think about that for a second. Early religious leaders praised the plagues because in their mind, in their view at the time, it showed that, oh, God is with us on our side because he brought these plagues in to just kill these people off with disease. We don't have to kill them. So we're the chosen people. How many times have we seen this sort of dynamic replayed throughout history, right? And so what are these 5 ritual observances of origin myths? Well, number 1, it constitutes the history of the facts of the founders, or what could be seen as the supernaturals, like the immortals, the gods, right? The people that came here that established this land, right? They're also considered to be true. Number 3 tells how an institution came into existence, right? Also, in performing the ritual associated with the myth, one, quote-unquote, experiences knowledge of the origin and claims one patriarchy. Thus, one lives the myth as a religion. So, in other words, by participating in the myth and the ritual of Thanksgiving, you're sort of fueling it, you're feeding it, you're living that myth as a living mythology, a living religion. And I'm actually going to turn to James's words again on pages 85 to 86. So here James goes on to say, my Random House Dictionary lists as its main heading for the Plymouth colonists not pilgrims, but pilgrim fathers. The Library of Congress similarly catalogs its holdings for Plymouth under pilgrim fathers, And of course, fathers is capitalized, meaning fathers of our country, not of pilgrim children. Thanksgiving has thus moved from history into the field of religion, civil religion, as Robert Bella has called it, to Bella. Civil religions hold society together. Plymouth Rock achieved iconographic status around 1880 when some enterprising residents of the town rejoined its two pieces on the waterfront and built a Greek template around it. The template became a shrine. The Mayflower Compact became a sacred text, and our textbooks began to play the same function as the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, teaching us the meaning behind the civil rite of Thanksgiving. Very interesting. The religious character of pilgrim history shines forth in an introduction by Valerian Paget to William Bradford's famous chronicle of Plymouth Plantation. Quote, the eyes of Europe were upon this little English handful of unconscious heroes and saints, taking courage from them step by step. For their children's children, the same ideals of freedom burned so clear and strong that the little episode we have just been contemplating resulted in the birth of the United States of America, and above all, of the establishment of the humanitarian ideals it typifies, and for which the pilgrims offered their sacrifice upon the altar of the sonship of man, sonship, S-O-N-S-H-I-P. In this invocation, the pilgrims supply not only the origin of the United States, but also the inspiration for democracy in Europe and perhaps for all goodness in the world today. I suspect that the original colonists, separatists and Anglicans alike, would have been amused. The civil ritual we practice marginalizes Indians. Our archetypal image of the first Thanksgiving portrays the groaning boards in the woods, with the pilgrims in their starched Sunday best next to their almost naked Indian guests. As a holiday greeting card puts it, eyes for the Indians we invited to share our food. The stillness of all this reaches its zenith in the handouts that school children have carried for decades, complete with captions such as, quote, they served pumpkins and turkeys and corn and squash. The Indians had never seen such a feast, unquote. When the Native American novelist Michael Doris's son brought home this information from his New Hampshire elementary school, Doris pointed out that the Pilgrims had literally never seen such a feast, since all foods mentioned are exclusively indigenous to the Americas and had been provided by, or with the aid of, the local tribe. So you can see that the propaganda is not only these vast declarations or like these vast omissions of information, but it's also in the wording. It's in the framing. It's every word is chosen so carefully to show that these pilgrims, were so gracious that they, invaded this entire continent of people and were gracious enough to share some of their own indigenous crops with them. And one of the things I was shocked to learn reading this book is that pilgrims actually had nothing to do with Thanksgiving. In fact, Eastern Native American tribes had performed and celebrated an autumnal harvest festival for centuries, all by themselves before any white people showed up. And so to suggest that Europeans showed up here in an area where they had no clue how to survive, had no clue what to plant, where and when to plant, what to hunt, where to find it, all those things were provided by the natives. But this story is presented as like, these gracious Europeans came and decided to share all these local native crops with the with the native peoples who've been growing these things and eating these things for years and had mastered, the growing of these crops, a millennia before these Europeans showed up. It's just, it's absolutely fascinating when you look at it's like once you see the trick, it's hard not to see it when you read through some of these entries, and so like I said, like the autumnal harvest festivals had gone on in Europe for a millennia. They gone on in the Americas for a millennia, with different foods, obviously, because different things are native, right? But these things were practiced because winter moves in, right? And you have to harvest all your crops before winter and store them. And you have to hunt for enough food to survive for the winter, right? All the animals are struggling for survival through the winter. All of the native individuals were struggling every year through each winter, right? And with that struggle, year after year, generation after generation, came like knowledge to a level that is beyond, to say that it's valuable is kind of insulting. And so, like I said, pilgrims had nothing to do with Thanksgiving. The fact is that George Washington, actually, he set aside some days for a national Thanksgiving while he was president. That's true. But when I say Thanksgiving, most people are going to think about the Thanksgiving that literally did not exist until the year 1863. And what took place in 1863? Well, this Civil War was taking place in 1863. The president was one of my favorites, Abraham Lincoln. He established Thanksgiving as a national holiday during the Civil War in 1863 because, for obvious reasons, during the Civil War, the need for patriotism and nationalism in a cohesive story was dire. The need for that was dire, right? And he knew this. So it was brilliant. So he formalized this Thanksgiving as a national holiday in 1863. Once that took place, individuals in his cabinet were tasked with, obviously, when is it going to be celebrated? How is it going to be celebrated? What is acceptable to celebrate? What isn't? All these details were hammered out by people in the 1860s, not the 16 or 1500s, when this event supposedly took place, right? So it wasn't even until the 1890s that the Pilgrims were even included in the story. So it was 30 years after this was already established as a national holiday, long after the event supposedly took place, that the Pilgrims were even mentioned in the story. And in fact, actually, the word pilgrim wasn't even used until the 1870s. So, thank God for James Loewen's work here, because if not, we would accept this pilgrim story that we're told, right? It's bunk. It's not, like I said, our modern conception of Thanksgiving didn't exist until 1863. The Pilgrims were not even included in the story until decades later in the 1890s. And the term pilgrim itself wasn't even used until the 1870s. So when you hear facts like that, that's when you go, oh, okay, yeah. This event didn't happen. Okay, this event clearly did not take place. And so what I'd like to do actually right now, I'm going to turn to James Loewen's takeaway from this. And I'm going to read from pages 87 to 88. His takeaway from this whole thing, right? So, James says, on occasion, this is on page 87, like I said, on occasion, we pay more direct cost to, when he's referring to these omissions and these inaccuracies in textbooks. On occasion, we pay a more direct cost, censorship. In 1970, for example, the Massachusetts Department of Commerce asked the Wampanoags to select a speaker to mark the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrim's Landing. Frank James was selected, but first he had to show a copy of his speech to the white people in charge of the ceremony. I like James's direct, just calling out what's happening here. When they saw what he had written, they would not allow him to read it. So what did James write? Well, here it is. James had written, and he had meant to read this in front of many, many white people on the 350th anniversary of the Pilgrims coming to the Americas and our celebration of Thanksgiving. Today is a time of celebrating for you, but it is not a time of celebrating for me. It is with heavy heart that I look back upon what happened to my people. The Pilgrims had hardly explored the shores of Cape Cod 4 days before they had robbed the graves of my ancestors and stolen their corn, wheat, and beans. Massasoit, the great leader of the Wampanoag, knew these facts, yet he and his people welcomed and befriended the settlers. Little knowing that, before 50 years were to pass, the Wampanoags, the other Indians living near the settlers, would be killed by their guns or dead from diseases that we caught from them. Although our way of life is almost gone and our language is almost extinct, we, the Wampanoags, still walk the lands of Massachusetts. What happened cannot be changed, but today we work toward a better America, a more Indian America, where people and nature, once again, are important. And I want to reread this last sentence again, because many people may hear this episode, they might hear my take on this, and even in response to the critique of our accepted American history, people will say, well, what do you want? You want the natives to take back over and kick us all out? There have been many native speakers whose speeches I've read. Chief Seattle being one of them, and this one that I discovered in this book. But Chief Seattle I've seen a lot of different places. Amazing speech, which I think he wrote that to the president. Maybe that's matter for another episode, but that's neither here nor there. My point is this quote I have not seen anywhere else besides in this book. And I'm someone who has read many accounts of Native peoples, books about Native Americans, book by Native Americans. I have a deep-seated reverence, love, and respect for those people. And this quote I have not ever seen anywhere except in this book. And what he says lastly here is so important. He says, what has happened cannot be changed. But today we work toward a better America, a more Indian America, where people and nature, once again, are important. Now, what doesn't he say here? He doesn't say that, man, I wish all you white people would get the hell out of here. He doesn't say, oh man, I wish all these things didn't happen. I'm sure he wishes they didn't happen. Any human being with common human decency would say, yeah, I wish that didn't happen. Of course. He's not saying, I want all the white people to go away. He's accepting what has happened. And he said, it's unfortunate that it happened, but we can't change that. But what does he wish for? A more Indian America. And what does that mean to him? It means an America where people and nature are once again important. Not corporate profits, not propaganda, not the utter control of all people on earth, but a a more Indian America, he means, the philosophy of it, where people and nature are more important, like they used to be. So I can see where someone could read that, a non-native person could read that and say, oh, they want to get rid of us and blah, blah, blah. No, that's not what he said. And in fact, he said he wishes that it could be an America where people and nature are once again important. Well, who could argue with that? Right? So what's my takeaway from this, right? So my takeaway is that obviously the story of Thanksgiving did not happen. At least not in the way we're told it did. Perhaps at some point somewhere there was a feast that took place where most likely what happened is the natives held a feast, welcomed the peaceful Europeans and pilgrims that they had made peace with, that proved they were peaceful, and invited them to dinner. That's a more likely scenario, right? And these mythological stories that we grew up reading and writing about, when they acted out in grade school, they were made to hold up the founders of the nation on a pedestal, right? And create this myth that would help foster this sense of patriotism in the country. The problem is that these myths were ethnocentric. I mean, to put it more simply, just racist. just straight up racist. But these myths, though, they were laid over top of these selective tales throughout history, could guard the mind against the terrible acts that took place by the founders, like slavery, torture, human trafficking, murder, rape, even the most horrible things you can imagine all happened, and all those other acts that took place. I mean, it's just this ethnocentric, lens that is put on our understanding of our history is just rooted in racism. It's that these native people weren't real people. They were below us, right? We were these Europeans that came in, and, God was on our side because, look, the plagues came in and wiped most of them out, 98% of them. So obviously, God's on our side, right? History books leave, I mean, they'll touch on some of them here and there, little blips and blurbs, but for the most part, they leave these stories out. And citizens growing up, hearing and believing these stories, they'll grow up, they'll serve in the military, they'll serve in the government, all with this backdrop of this American exceptionalism that they read about, that they grew up reading about. They grew up learning about this from age 5, coming into class and dressing as a pilgrim or dressing like an Indian, right? And saying these words and doing little plays for the parents, right? This is a acting out of a mythology. And this happened year after year after year. And you get to high school and it's reinforced by these more factual, quote unquote, accounts of these things you acted out as a child, right? And I think that someone that grows up like that are far less likely to question authority, especially when it comes to government authority from our military, government, police, maybe even. They won't question the obvious superiority of Europeans who became Americans that founded our country. And and to be clear, the lies aren't just found in our history books. But this, to me, is a starting point for all the lies that compile upon those stories of propaganda we heard about in school, that we acted out as kids and then learned about with more detail as adults, young adults in high school, right? And it just built upon with more and more propaganda. I graduated in high school in 1990, and so I probably used one of these textbooks that James talks about here, and lies my teacher told me. And I grew up believing many of these stories. I took it as gospel because I wouldn't have, in those days, I wouldn't have thought in a million years that these things, they were boring as hell, but I would not have ever thought that these things were just not true. These stories were just not true. I wouldn't have in a million years thought of it until reading this book. And then going, and after that, going on to read other books, which, I may get into this season. That's going to be a major theme in this season of The Bunker, actually. And I'm going to be going back to James's book for different topics, as well as many other writers, to highlight the number of historical events that simply did not take place in the way that we were told. Now, that said, let's take Thanksgiving in our modern conceptualization of it, right? I grew up celebrating Thanksgiving. Growing up as a kid, it was one of my favorite holidays, actually. And I feel like modern Americans that still celebrate Thanksgiving today, I feel have a purer vision, much purer vision of the holiday that even people that constructed the holiday back in the 1860s even thought of it. I think that the modern conceptualization of it and the practice of it is far more pure and powerful than it was conceived of in the 1860s. And like I had touched on brilliantly, Abraham Lincoln, nationalized this holiday as a way to just make people feel better, to just make a cohesive mythology for people to take into themselves and give themselves a greater sense of community, as like a national community, I mean, in the United States, because this was during the Civil War. So, nationalism, patriotism was needed more than ever in the history of our country up to that point, right? You could say it's, we're in that point again, but that's a different episode. But think about it. How do individuals celebrate Thanksgiving today? Well, families and friends from all, that may be scattered across the country, across the world even, spend days traveling, in some cases lots of money, to get together at a feast where they will celebrate all the events, the blessings, perhaps even more in those who are no longer with us, right? Oh, it's the first Thanksgiving without so-and-so, right? Or, hey, let's celebrate, oh, so-and-so had a promotion, and that took place in March, but the family's been apart this whole time. So when are they going to celebrate it? They're going to celebrate it when they're all together. And for many people, for millions of people, that's Thanksgiving. And I mean, in my opinion, if you remove all the historical myths that we grew up believing and celebrating and acting out in school and learning about in school, if you remove all of that and you just celebrate the holiday just as I described it just now, just individuals getting together, traveling hundreds of miles, maybe in some cases thousands of miles, to get together with friends and family to celebrate, come together and feast, right? That is to me, that's a visceral, powerful holiday, the harvest, right? Before the winter rolls in, that's the time when like real struggle happens. That's when like food is scarce, and throughout human history, that's been a time where, on areas of Earth where there are seasons, right? That is a time of bracing for the struggle. And in modern times, that's, it's celebrated in the same way, but also just people coming together and celebrating and feasting together. That to me is like the most basic, visceral level of survival that you could celebrate. And so in that sense, the holiday is celebrated in a more pure form in modern day by most people. Anyway, so that's my take on Thanksgiving. I want to thank James Loewen for writing this work. I want to thank all of our fans who have stuck with us throughout not only all our past episodes, but also through this long hiatus. We are going to be, like I mentioned earlier, tackling a lot of historical events and challenging the details of those events. That's going to be a running theme this year, but you're also going to hear episodes about paranormal, about our investigations. We're currently on a break from West Hill Manor, Beth and myself. We were excited this year to invite Jason Hawes and JV to investigate West Hill, which they did. Found some pretty compelling, interesting evidence and had a real good time at it. Some other possibly exciting things coming for that location in the future, which I cannot yet talk about, but we are still investigating. Beth is still having classes, teaching others how to develop their psychic abilities, and we're still doing our thing. It's just we have not been online and not been podcasting about it, but that will change this year. So I want to again thank everyone for coming along to join us on this awesome journey, and I look forward to joining you once again in the bunker.